Hello and welcome to Smart Training 365. Thank you for joining us today. I'm with Doug Brignole. How you doing, Doug?
Hey Mo, how are you?
I'm doing great. Yeah, I liked the video that you did with Mike Israetel, and as the viewers will see today and discover that you may have thought that that was a great video, but after the video in the comment section, I commented and. Mike Israetel surprised me saying that he wasn't really convinced at all, and I asked him to mention why he wasn't convinced. So he wrote down the 5 points that, based on that, you made this video. So I hope you enjoy this video. It's very in depth, so make sure to sit back, relax, and enjoy the show.
Thank
Doug?
you guys. So,
Okay.
hi everyone. I am here today to explain and review the video that I did with Scott Hall of Revive Stronger and Mike Israetel. And there were some things that I wanted to clarify, some posts that Mike put up on the YouTube comment section that I wanted to respond to. So hopefully this will be very educational for you. Okay, I want to start off by saying that we had scheduled this recording session for February 3rd. All right, we did this about a month in advance. So the objective of this recording was to have Mike Israetel review my book and comment about what I present in the book. And there's my book, The Physics of Resistance Exercise. Now on January 6th, which is nearly 1 month before our show taping, I sent Mike and Scott the ebook version of The Physics of Resistance Exercise. 23 days later, 3 days before the show taping, Mike sent me an email letting me know he wasn't able to open the ebook on his computer and could I send it to him as a PDF. Of course, I sent it to him right away, but 23 days later. So Mike did not actually read the book prior to the taping. He only had it for 3 days. He admits on the video that he took a few glances at it. And another part of the video, he said, I jumped to the back section. Scott said he read like a little bit more than the first half of the book. So neither one of them read the whole book. Of course, Scott's kind of irrelevant because he didn't really participate in the conversation. But Mike did say that he only jumped to the back. Now, you'll see here throughout this video, the comments that he's made, evidence that he did not read the book. In fact, he says some things that literally would have, if he had read the previous page or the next paragraph, you know, the statement is already wrong. So he clearly did not read the book. Now, I know Mike Israetel is very busy. I'm not faulting him for not reading the book. He might have had a very good reason for waiting 23 days to tell me that he didn't get the book. However, this review, any review of that conversation has to include the context that Mike didn't have the information that's in the book. And a lot of his comments demonstrate that. So that is the context of this review. All right, so the first thing that, and by the way, what you'll see here is the questioning demonstrates that he was looking for something to fault. Now, one might say, well, what's the point of looking for something to agree on? All right, well, it was supposed to be a book review. It's supposed to be a conversation that included the good and the bad, right? But instead, it seemed like he found 5 things, or thought he found 5 things worthy of criticizing, and that seemed to be the objective. And that's probably why he thought, well, I only need 3 days, 2-3 days to find a few things to find wrong. So the first question he said was, in this one paragraph right here, you say the possibility of glenoid dislocation, which I mentioned is one of the possible consequences of heavy bench pressing. This next slide, I'll show you a little close up. That's the paragraph he's talking about. One potential consequence of doing a very heavy bench press is illustrated in 1315. The injury is called anterior dislocation of the humerus. Basically, what I'm saying there is that the head of the humerus can either be pushed forward out of socket or pulled forward out of socket. And it could easily happen with a very heavy bench press, especially when you get down to the bottom and the pectoral muscle is pulling from around the corner and it's pulling more forward than it is in. Okay, so Mike really seemed to question how viable, how likely that is to happen. And then he posted this on the YouTube video comment section. In the book, glenoid dislocation is proposed as a downside of deep barbell pressing. During the discussion, meaning during the video, Doug revised his opinion on this, stating that he actually thought pectoral avulsion or rupture was the bigger risk by far. You'll see that wasn't a revision. He might want to call it a revision. That's not a revision. Thus, if we read the book as written, he didn't read the book. So maybe if he said, if we read the paragraph as written, even still, it wouldn't be accurate. We would avoid benching because of fear of glenoid dislocation. But if we listen to what Doug says here, we might actually think bench pressing is okay as long as it's not heavier than a 5-rep max. What's the last word on this? Okay, so clearly the context there is suggesting that I can't make up my mind, that I'm wishy-washy, that I say one thing in the book and I say another thing in the video. Let's look a little closer. So let's just sort of synopsize what he's saying there. Doug thinks the downside of bench pressing is shoulder dislocation. Doug revised his view during the show, admitting that rupture is the bigger risk. Doug then revised his view that benching is only risky if it's heavy. Doug can't make up his mind. He says one thing in the book, another on the show. All right. I don't comment in the book at all about which is the bigger risk. I never say that this is the number one biggest risk, this is the number two. I don't say it at all. I just say benching heavy, doing anything super heavy, has higher risk of injury. And then I mentioned shoulder dislocation as one possible consequence. Second point, people do bench presses heavier than they do other exercises because they regard it as a barometer of strength. Nobody would do a 1 rep or a 2 or 3 rep max lying dumbbell press, right? They do the bench press for 1, 2, 3 reps because they think that it's a strength builder more so than using dumbbells, which is not necessarily true. And they want to establish some kind of hierarchy. They want to identify what their max 1 rep is. And even if their goal is primarily muscle building or bodybuilding, and that's a completely different type of goal with higher risk and much less benefit to the pecs. Heavy bench press creates a higher risk of injury. Bench press is already not a great pectoral exercise, even if you're using a weight that allows you to get 10 reps or 8 reps. It's got limited range of motion. It's got, you're pushing more out than you are toward the midline of the body. And doing a 1 to 3 rep max is not in the hypertrophy range. Now, the previous page of this comment regarding the dislocation thing, in this little section here, I say, let's examine the bench press. It's considered a foundational exercise by many people, and it is one of the most popular compound exercises. It mostly engages the pectorals along with some involvement of the triceps and the anterior deltoids. In addition to being used for the purpose of muscular development, it is also considered a strength builder. The question is, how does it compare with other pectoral tricep exercises in terms of effectiveness, efficiency, and safety? So if you would have just gone to the previous page, you would have seen the context here was to evaluate the bench press in terms of productivity for pectoral building and consequence for injury, possibility for injury, using it the way people typically use it, which is to go very, very heavy on it for testing their strength. Okay, so 2 paragraphs before the paragraph he commented on, I say this: if your goal is muscular development, you never need to perform 1 repetition max lift of any kind. It's completely unproductive for the goal of muscular development. The lowest number of reps that is likely to be productive for muscle growth is 4, although realistically it's probably closer to 6. Performing fewer reps than that with heavier weight produces less muscular growth with a much higher risk of injury. So as you can see right there, I'm not saying anything about glenoid dislocation. What I'm saying is going heavy has higher risk of injury. Glenoid dislocation happens to be one of them. I didn't say it was greater than pectoral rupture. I didn't say it was less than pectoral rupture, but he was really sort of hammering that point. And then when I said, well, I suppose pectoral rupture might be, you've revised your opinion. I didn't have an opinion expressed in the beginning. That wasn't the issue. Okay, let's look at some of the literature. This is the Army Public Health Center, weight training injuries discussion of the bench press. Number one is the rupture. Number two is joint dislocation. So am I out in left field suggesting that shoulder dislocation is far-fetched? No. How about this one? High Mountain Orthopedics. 3 most common shoulder injuries from working out. Shoulder dislocation is the one I've circled there. Rotator cuff injury is the first. Here's another one, Total Ortho Express. Why does my shoulder hurt after bench pressing? Because heavy bench pressing is very, very stressful on the shoulder joint. How about another one, Physio Health, anterior shoulder instability and the bench press. Look at the last part of the part I've underlined there, anterior shoulder dislocations is what they're talking about. Last sentence, consequently, this is why the bench press, which places the shoulder into a similar position, can be problematic. So again, I'm not out in left field, but he was trying to suggest that, glenoid dislocation, that's super unlikely. It's not exactly unlikely. Another one, 6 reasons why you have shoulder pain when you bench press. Right? So yes, heavy bench presses can cause a lot of shoulder problems. I discourage bench press in part because it's not a good bodybuilding exercise, and in part because people don't use it like they use other exercises. They use it as a test of strength, which has a much higher risk of injury. Now, this is a video you'll see on YouTube. This person is very young guy. He's very well developed. His name is Tristan. You can look it up on YouTube. It's called My Shoulder Popped While Benching, Had to Go to the Hospital. Okay, so number 1 photo there, he's getting ready, tightening his belt. Number 2, he's lowering the bar. Number 3, he's raising the bar. He's already popped his left shoulder. You can see the spotter is already grabbing the left side of the bar, right? And then the 4th picture is, he's pulling the bar off his chest. Slide number 5, the bar has been racked. He's grabbing his left shoulder. He's leaning forward in pain. He's wincing. Popped his left shoulder, had to go to the hospital. Did he tear his pec? No, he did not tear his pec. He popped his shoulder. Now, what's the actual injury? We don't know. But the point is, when you're going heavy on the bench press, shoulder problems, injuries, damage can happen. That's the point of what I'm saying. The last paragraph in that section is the bench press can be used safely with some degree of benefit. Some degree of benefit. When using moderate weight, on the other hand, it is still not an especially good exercise for physique development. There are better pectoral exercises as well as better tricep exercises. This statement is not meant as an indictment of the bench press. Rather, the bench press is simply another example of a popular compound exercise that is not quite as good for muscle building as everyone has been led to believe. There's nothing ambiguous about my position here. It's all spelled out there in the book. This is another example of how Mike did not read either of these 2 pages. The one that has the comment he singled out, the previous page, and all of that page right there. If he would have just read those 2 pages, he would not have taken the position that Doug thinks shoulder dislocation is the biggest risk, and then he changes his mind, he revises it. No, it's very clearly stated right there. I do not state in my book that shoulder dislocation is the primary reason a person should avoid bench pressing. He surmised that. Pectoral rupture may be more likely, may be more common, but shoulder dislocation is still one of several possible injuries that can occur with heavy bench presses, and also tricep rupture I've seen. The point is simply that bench presses going heavy has risks that are unnecessary if your goal is maximum pectoral development. The next question that he picked out was this. Spinal compression, this is what Doug says, spinal compression and herniated discs are prolific problems, especially as individuals get older. Millions of people struggle with back pain who never performed heavy deadlifts. The last thing we need is additional potential cause of spinal compression and herniated disc problems. Now, the red thing is there's something I added. The way it reads in the book is the less spinal compression and hyperflexing of the spine while loaded we experience in our lifetime, the better. Okay, so now I agreed. Mike pointed this out, and I said, well, I probably should have said the less excessive spinal compression, because I'm not saying that we shouldn't put anything at all on our backs or something that would pull our spine down. I'm not saying that at all. But the less of that we do, the better. So it logically makes sense to eliminate the exercises that are actually unnecessary, unproductive for our goal. If we can find better exercise to do that and reduce the amount of total compression we get, it's a good idea. Okay, so later in the comment section of the YouTube video, Mike posted this. In the book, as if he read the book, Doug asserted that spinal compression is a problem as we get older. This is the direct opposite of the truth. Spinal compression is essential to musculoskeletal health as we age. So let's see if that's true. There is actually zero scientific literature which states spinal compression is essential for healthy vertebral bone. Density is what's missing there, bone density. Weight bearing is the universal term that's used as the recommendation. None of the literature, you will not find any literature out there that says the spine must be loaded with 400 pounds or more in order to optimize spinal bone density. You will not find that. And you will absolutely not find anything that says spinal compression is essential. Weight bearing, WebMD, is the common term used. Look at what they say. Lifting weights, using weight machines, doing calisthenics, you're working at some form of exercise. There's no mention there of deadlift. There's no mention there of heavy squats. Strength training at least twice a week, not much, right, is needed to stimulate bone growth. Now, I would say this statement here is a far cry from the statement that spinal compression is essential. Here's one from the osteogenic, from the American Bone Health. Weight bearing activity is what they recommend. No mention whatsoever of deadlifts, no mention of squats, no mention of an amount of deadlift or squat. Here's an article by the American Journal of Lifestyle Medicine where they discuss osteoporosis and strength training. So yes, studies have shown that strength training does improve bone density. I'm not disagreeing with that. I've never said otherwise. There is no mention, however, saying that, you know, there's a certain amount of weight that's required in order to get that. It's just weight bearing. Nothing, of course, that says the heavier the better. Nothing. That's sort of the suggestion that Mike is saying, is that if you're squatting heavy, it's better for your spine than if you're squatting light. There's no study that suggests performing barbell squats, I think I put there, or deadlifts with 400 pounds doubles the spinal bone density that would be caused by squatting or deadlifting 200 pounds. So this idea that the heavier the better, that there's somehow a direct correlation between how much you're squatting or deadlifting will determine how much spine density, bone density you have on your spine, that's ridiculous. There's no study that suggests performing 100-pound deadlifts, 100-pound dumbbell shrugs with only 50 pounds in each hand is insufficient for optimizing spinal bone density. Now, 50, 60 pounds, most of us that are doing shrugs, we use 50 or 60 pounds, maybe 70 or 80 pounds, right? That's pushing down on the shoulder carriage, pushing down on the spine. That's stimulating bone growth. Oh, is that insufficient? Now we got to put a metal bar directly on our spine with 400, 500 pounds, or else we won't get the benefit? That's absurd. Weight bearing, loading the skeleton, includes any and all types of lifting, including carrying the weights to and from the racks. Does not require spinal compression, nor certainly with super heavy weight. Now look at this. This shows that spinal compression is actually an issue worth being concerned about. The effects of physiological biomechanical loading on intradiscal pressure and annulus stress in the lumbar spine. How about two more? From the Journal of Novel Physiotherapy and Physical Rehabilitations, methods for avoiding and reducing high spinal loads in everyday life. How about this one from the Brigham Young University? The passive load-bearing capacity of the human lumbar spine in the neutral standing posture. So nothing in the literature saying the more weight you use on your spine, the better, but several things suggesting that spinal compression is something to be concerned about, and certainly excessive, more than the minimum you need to get in order to build the muscle you want to build, is just foolish. Look at this study. This study concluded, this is published in the National Library of Medicine, concluded that weight training decreases vertebral bone density in premenopausal women. This is called the Rockwell study. Okay, here it is, same study, different journal, Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism. I've underlined it there. Despite the increase in muscle strength, lumbar spine density in the exercising women decreased by 2.9% at 4.5 months and by 3.9% at 9 months. In contrast, there was no change in lumbar density in the controls, meaning the women that were not doing the weight training, over the 9-month period. The last sentence there is, we conclude that short-term weight training at this frequency and intensity decreases vertebral bone density in premenopausal women. So I think it's ironic, right, that we don't find anything in the literature that says we must squat heavy, that a 400-pound deadlift increases bone density twice as much as a 200-pound deadlift. We don't find anything like that, but we find something like this that says that weight training decreases bone. Now, look, I'm not saying I believe this study. I'm not saying that. I am saying that the statement that Mike made that spinal compression is essential is false, number one. Weight bearing is essential, yes. And something like this just demonstrates how something went wrong with the study. I think it's logical to assume that if you load bone, it will adapt by getting stronger, by getting denser. Just like if you go out in the sun, your skin will adapt by getting darker and, adapting to that need, right? So I don't believe the study, but I want to point this out because I think it's important for all of us to understand studies can't all be trusted. Things go wrong, right? You can't pick and choose which study to believe. You have to take every study you see with a grain of salt and assume that something might not have added up. Okay. As you can see, the spine, this is the side view from the spine, is not straight. It has these curves, the cervical, the lumbar at the bottom, the thoracic in the middle. And what you see there is if you push down hard enough on these curves, it will behave like an accordion, right? Those curves will increase their degree of bend, all right? And of course, the intervertebral discs in between could get squeezed one direction or another as a result of that. So that is using your eyes, using your sense of logic. This is sensible. Now, these illustrations here are not something I made. These are in the literature. Excessive spinal compression may flatten intervertebral discs, may cause disc herniation due to these spinal curvatures, and may cause compression fracture of the vertebrae. This is fact. I'm not inventing that. The spine and the intervertebral discs have capacity limits. The greater the load on the spine, the compression, the greater the injury risk. Optimal spinal bone density can be achieved without excessive spinal loading. 200-pound shrugs, 100 pounds in each hand, good. 400-pound squats, 600-pound deadlifts, not necessary for good spine health, spine bone density, not necessary. Arguably not necessary for muscle development, given better options, which we demonstrate, we explain these better options, right? So the idea that I'm doing this 400-pound or a 600-pound squat or a deadlift for muscle building reasons, but oh, by the way, my spine is also benefiting? Not entirely true. Okay, moving on to the third item that Mike questioned. Incline presses are, this is what Doug says, incline presses are not optimally productive for upper pecs because it requires moving the arms in a direction where there are no pectoral fiber origins. He took an issue to that, right? As most people would who are traditionalists, as most people would who are dogmatic in their beliefs about old school weight training. So then he says, incline presses aren't supposed to be done like this, and performs the gesture you see here. Now you have eyes, you can see what he's doing there. Does that look like he's doing an incline press? Obviously, he did not mimic the motion of an incline press, and yet he was pretending to. His arms are moving almost in the direction of an overhead press. His arm is almost alongside his ear. Now, I think we should stop for a moment and ask ourselves, was that an accident? I think Mike knows that an incline press does not move logically in the direction of pectoral fibers because it moves in a direction above the shoulder and there's no pectoral fibers above the shoulder. So you needed to exaggerate in order to sort of be persuasive. He continues, they're supposed to be done like this. At least that's how I do them, he says. And he does what you see there. Clearly, that's not an incline press either. That looks like a flat press. In fact, well, flat press at least, maybe even a slight decline, but certainly not an incline press. And then he points to his upper pectoral muscles, explaining how that's alignment with his arm. Well, it's alignment with his arm when he's moving in a flat bench direction. Right? That's not his right arm that he's holding out right there. He's doing this. Is not in an incline angle. It's at a flat angle. I mean, we have eyes. You know, we have to look at this stuff. Now, let's explain what happens during an incline press and what we've been told, right? So the illustration there, the image on the right of the screen shows a graphic that's been circulated frequently. And this particular graphic here has it placed right next to an incline bench showing various degrees of incline. And it says, set your bench angle between 30 and 45 degrees to work your chest. And why do they say that? Because the graphic there has a dark blue line saying 30-degree upper chest and 45-degree upper chest. Okay, let's look at this graphic a little closer. So I put the green arrow there to show that's supposedly the shoulder joint. Okay, so the line that is straight across from the shoulder joint is a flat press, flat fry. And what they say there is it's overall chest. The two lines below that are lower chest, two lines above that are upper chest. And the line that goes straight up there, they say shoulders, like military press. Okay, so clearly that dot is supposed to be the shoulder joint. Okay, now if you look at that, you think, all right, we've been told this for so many years, we don't question it. But put that dot on somebody's shoulder joint and look what it looks like. You can see that the flat press lines up with the upper pecs. The lower lines line up with the pectoral fibers that are below the clavicle. But the lines that are moving in the inclined direction don't line up to anything that's pectoral related. This is factual. This is not, you know, I'm not making this stuff up. Look, if we had been designed with our arm sockets right in the middle between the highest and the lowest part of the pectorals, then there would be something to move down toward and something to move up toward. But that's not how we were designed. We were designed with all of our pectoral fibers below our shoulder joint, probably because we evolved from a quadruped and moved progressively more upright into bipedalism. But we never ever had to accommodate an incline angle press historically of any kind. There'd be no reason to adapt to that. Now, here, what I'm showing is that if you're on an incline bench, your arms must go above the shoulder line. And the reason they must go above the shoulder line is because you must push directly opposite gravity. Gravity is vertical. It's pulling straight down. Gravity is pulling at a 6 o'clock direction, you must move directly opposite gravity, which is a 12 o'clock direction. There's just no way that you can then take your arm toward your sternum. You're moving it toward your neck or toward your chin. It's inevitable. So what I've done here is I've placed a figure here at a 30-degree angle, assuming there's an incline bench there, it's set at 30 degrees. And the blue line that's there is the direction his arms would move on an incline press because it's vertical. You can see that is above all the pectoral fibers. It is literally crossing the lower part of his neck. Now, the A arrow there that I have, that's what I call a slight decline angle. The B arrow is the extreme decline angle. Those are both good. The A arrow is better, but the B arrow is still good. The arrow that doesn't have a letter above the A shows a flat press. That's not quite as good because you're hitting fewer fibers, but certainly the blue one is completely away from any pectoral fibers. Here's a couple of illustrations that show you from a slightly different angle. Okay, so the image on the far left, what I've done is I've taken that white arrow and I've started it right at his pectoral insertion on his humerus. And he's moving it straight forward on a flat bench. And you can see it's going straight to the highest pectoral fibers on his sternum and the clavicular fibers. Now, the one in the middle there, I'm moving it into an incline angle. You could see it is not moving consistent with any pectoral fibers. It is far above the clavicular fibers. The image on the far right is a slight decline angle moving toward the center of the sternum, which is slightly below the shoulder joint. That's where the greatest number of pectoral fibers are situated, and that is the wisest angle to move your arms. A little bit closer look. The flat direction, the incline direction, and the slight decline direction. Again, let's use our eyes. Let's use our logic. Let's not be dogmatic and refuse to look at the evidence of what's actually happening when you do an incline, a flat, a decline. Let's look at this and not be deniers. All right, so in addition to the arms not moving toward the upper pectoral muscles origins when you're doing an incline press, the line of force is also not aligned with the upper pecs. Okay, so let me explain to you what that illustration is. Imagine that you took a rope and you threw it over a tree branch, brought the other end down, tied a weight to both ends, and stood back. Obviously, the weight is being pulled in a 6 o'clock direction. If you then climbed up onto the tree and put a little scale underneath various parts of the rope, you would find that the greatest downward force from that weight is at the 12 o'clock position. That is the line of force, directly opposite resistance. If you were to measure, let's say, the 10 o'clock position or the 2 o'clock position, you would find significantly less load there than at the 12 o'clock position. Less still at 9 and 3 o'clock, obviously, right? So the line of force the line of force determines what muscle gets the load and what muscle does not, period. It's not the direction of your movement that determines that. It's the direction of the resistance that determines where the load is going. Let's look at it from a slightly different angle. So imagine that this man represents resistance and he's pulling on your body and he's pulling in a direction that is 7:30 on a clock. The load will be on the 130 muscle. Whatever muscle is at 130 will be the most loaded. So if your target muscle, because you didn't think this thing through, is positioned at 12 o'clock or at 3 o'clock, it will not be getting the majority of the load. Whatever muscle is positioned directly opposite the resistance in the line of force will be what is most loaded, whether you want it to be that way or not. It's physics, right? This is just fact. Another way of looking at this, if you stood in front of a mirror, you took a barbell, let's just say you took just for the sake of demonstration, you took a 50-pound barbell, right? If you took a 200-pound barbell, you'd never be able to do this. If you faced a mirror and pushed the barbell toward the mirror, you'd be doing this motion that in most cases would be considered a chest movement, a chest exercise. However, your pectoral muscle would not be the least bit loaded doing it this way. Why? Because they're not in the line of force. The shoulders are directly opposite the downward force. So as you press out, this thing wants to fall down, and you'd be working like crazy to keep this bar from falling forward because they are directly in the line of force, not the pectorals. Conversely, if you were to lie down on your back, now you're loading the pecs. Why? You're doing the same movement. What's the change? The direction of resistance, or your body relative to the direction of resistance. Now, the 6 o'clock direction of resistance is loading whatever is at 12 o'clock. And that would be, in this case, the upper pectoral fibers. So now what I've done here is made it a little bit more graphic so you can really get it. So here is a man on his back on a flat bench. The shoulder joint is the fulcrum, right? So that's where the line of force is determined, right? Gravity is pulling 6 o'clock. Directly in the line of force, as you can see, there is the upper pectoral fibers, right? Now, let's turn him on an incline bench. You can see now that line of force would line up with his neck muscles, but his neck muscles are not connected to his arms. So they can't, you're not loading the neck muscles. You're actually not loading anything more than the front deltoids at that point, right? Are the pectoral muscles helping? Are they participating at all? Yes, they probably are participating. Again, it goes back to that clock I showed you. They're not in the 10 o'clock position. They're in the 1 o'clock position. They're off to the side a little bit. Yes, they get some load, but not the majority of the load. Now I've turned this man into a slight decline angle. This is a 15 to 20 degree angle. You can see the line of force now places the resistance in the middle of his sternum, where the greatest number of pectoral fibers are located. Again, it's not the movement that determines which muscle fibers are activated. It is the direction of resistance that determines which muscles are, well, I shouldn't say activated, but loaded. Okay, it's the line of force. So after the video, Mike puts this statement up on the it says, Doug proposed that incline barbell work doesn't train the upper pec fibers, which is absurd on its face, and in fact, empirically false. And to that I say, that's a very intellectually lazy perspective. Okay, that is you saying, I don't have to think this through. I don't have to look at these line of force illustrations that Doug is showing in the book. You know, somebody's already done an EMG study. It happens to, you know, jive with my preference anyway, so I'm going to embrace it. And in the meantime, I'm going to say that anyone who counters that is making an absurd statement. That's just lazy. Okay, so what I say here is Mike hangs his hat on a preference that serves his purpose. But here's another study that concluded no significant difference was seen in upper or an upper pectoral stimulation between incline and decline barbell presses. I'm going to show this to you a little closer. So this is the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research, right? This is a scientific journal. And you can see there what I've highlighted there and what I've underlined in red. No significant differences were seen in upper pectoral activation between incline and decline bench press. Now, obviously, this flies in the face of the study that Mike wanted to believe. Do I believe this study? About as much as I believe that study about decreasing bone density in women when they were doing weight training. I don't believe this either, right? I'm not saying I prefer the study. I think they're both wrong because both of them ignore logical counterarguments, and that is the line of force determines which muscle is loaded. If you change the direction of resistance, you change where that load goes. If you change your position, your body position relative to the downward pull of gravity, you change where that load goes. You can't do an incline and a decline and have the load go to the same place. It's illogical, right? We have to use logic. We can't just cover our eyes and cover our ears and say, oh, well, the study said. I mean, let us not abandon our logic. We have to move on. This is one of the rules. You have to move your arm toward the origin of your target muscle, and you have to have a directly opposing resistance so the line of force lines up with that. We have seen a number of studies that have completely illogical conclusions. We should not be lazy and just say, well, a study has already shown that. I like what the study says. I'm going to use it as my evidence to support my belief to refute anybody else's counterargument. Sometimes conventional wisdom is not correct. I'm going to give you an example of that. Isaac Newton's Principia. Isaac Newton, of course, is respected as one of the greatest minds in the history of science. In his book, he states, energy equals mass times velocity. Okay? You, a lazy person, a person who doesn't question anything, would say, all right, well, he is Isaac Newton, right? And if what he's saying conforms with something that I want to believe, I'm going to use Isaac Newton's principle there as evidence that I'm right. What I'm preaching is right, right? This is what we do. We find evidence to support our argument, and we use it to defend our argument because we want that argument to be true. Turns out that equation is wrong. In the mid-1700s, Émile du Châtelet, a French philosopher and mathematician, showed that the correct formula is actually energy equals mass times velocity squared, which is drastically different. Okay, so what they did is they showed that a lead ball traveling at twice the velocity of another lead ball, the same size and weight, produces an impact that's 4 times greater when it lands, not 2 times greater. Even though the velocity was twice, not 4 times as much, it's 4 times greater on impact. So it pays to question things. It pays to scratch your head and say, you know, something's not adding up here. But we abandon our logic usually. We usually think, well, somebody else has done the work on that. I'm too lazy to question it. I'm too lazy to look behind the curtain. I'm just going to accept it, and I'm going to use it as my evidence. It's easy to believe Isaac Newton. It's easy to believe a study that you like. It's not easy to listen to a refutation and take it seriously and consider it and be thoughtful and be respectful and say, you know, this person's not a PhD. What could he possibly know? I'm not going to read his book. That's not a sensible approach. Mike's next question in the book was this. Doug says stiff-legged deadlifts do not produce sufficient muscle shortening, contraction, to cause significant hamstring hypertrophy. Okay, he didn't like that. Okay, let's do a review. Here are the reasons why people think that straight-legged deadlifts are good for the hamstrings. Number one, they feel the stretch when their hip is fully flexed and their knees are straight or mostly straight. Okay, clue number one. Number two, they believe the hamstring plays a major role in hip extension. Why do they believe that? They've heard it. They haven't seen evidence of that, but they've heard it. Number three, some EMG studies have suggested that hamstring activation is high during a straight-legged deadlift. So let's look a little closer. But before I turn the page here, let me just say that if I push my hands together like this and I create isometric tension in my chest and I put an EMG electrode on my chest, it'll register a high reading, high activation. So what an EMG measures is activation. Doesn't measure growth potential, does not measure range of motion, does not measure early phase loading or late phase loading. It just measures activation. That's a small part of what informs us of whether an exercise is actually productive. So let's start off with just a simple explanation. We need to understand what makes joints move, okay? Basically, it is the principle that when a muscle crosses over to the other side of a joint and then it contracts, it either bends that joint, as in the case of a bicep, or it extends that joint in the case of the tricep, or the one there on the right is the quadricep. That's a knee joint. Okay, so in the case of the bicep or the tricep or the quadricep, you can see there's one single tendon that the 2 or the 3 or the 4 muscles merge with. And so there's one action, and that action is delivered by way of that one single tendon. We're going to look at hip extension here because hip extension is the primary action of a stiff-legged deadlift. In the case of a joint that has more than one muscle that is participating in that action, we can estimate the degree of participation of each of those muscles by three things. One is the size of that muscle, and the other is the origin and the insertion, the leverage of that muscle. Okay, so I'm going to show you a demonstration here. Okay, so what I'm showing you here is a model that I made of an arm and the bicep crossing the elbow joint. Okay, so I just added this and this insertion points today for the purpose of this video, but this is where the bicep insertion typically is. And when the bicep contracts, you can see it flexes the joint. Okay, so the distance between the joint and the insertion determines the amount of leverage, right? So the closer to the joint the insertion is, the less leverage. The farther on the other side of the joint the insertion is, the greater the leverage. So if I were to take this little hook right here and clip it on there, right, and I pull on this thing, it's going to require a certain amount of force, more than this one did, but less. This one requires less. Okay, because now what I have is a ratio of this to this versus this to this. Okay, so the muscle that has the greater origin is the muscle that has the origin way above the hip joint and way below the hip joint. That's the greatest leverage. And the closer it gets to the actual joint, the less leverage, the less potential that joint actually has. Okay, so when we do hip extension, which is what happens during a straight-legged deadlift, there are three muscles that are participating in that action: the gluteus maximus, the adductors, and the hamstrings. Now, I've made the gluteus maximus in blue because it is the greater of the three muscles, as you'll soon see. The adductors and the hamstrings are lesser participants. Now, these three muscles participate in hip extension in different degrees. They're not all the same contributors, right? They have different degrees of participation, and we're going to see how that's determined. Okay, so let's start off with the gluteus maximus. This is in Physiopedia. You can see there, the gluteus is described as the largest and heaviest muscle in the body, not just of the three hip extension muscles. It's the biggest muscle of the body. It is a massive muscle. It weighs more than any other single muscle in the body. It has great leverage. It's very powerful. Here, what I'm showing you is that the green arrow is pointing to the hip joint. And I've got an arrow at the top and an arrow at the bottom showing the origin and the insertion of the gluteus. The origin is way above the hip joint, and the insertion is way below the hip joint. That's a lot of very powerful leverage, in addition to a lot of muscle mass doing the participation for hip extension. Okay, the adductors are the second largest of the three hip extension muscles. Now, I want you to notice the insertion obviously is well below the hip joint. The origin is on the lower part of the pelvis. Now, do you see those two little bony loops there at the bottom of the pelvis? That's called the ischial tuberosity. Okay, the gracilis there, a small part of the adductor is connected to the ischial tuberosity, but most of the adductors are connected above the ischial tuberosity, which, as you can see there, is barely even with or slightly lower than the hip joint, which means that even though the adductors participate in hip extension, they can't participate as much as the gluteus maximus. It just doesn't have the leverage, nor does it have the mass, the size. So it is not a big player. This is the hamstring. It is the smallest of the three hip extension muscles, but look where its origin is. It's on the ischial tuberosity, lower than that of the adductors. So I've placed a green arrow there showing you where the joint is. So as I showed you on this thing here, the closer it is to being on the other side of the joint, the less leverage you have. But as you can see here, the hamstring isn't even on the other side of the joint. It's on the same side of the joint as the insertion is. If you were designing a mechanism, let's say you were participating in an engineering class and your professor said, I want you to design a mechanism that makes this joint move. And you turn this in, you'd probably get a failing grade. He would say, this is a terrible mechanism for moving this particular joint. I mean, will it play a role? Yeah, it'll play a small role, but it is not, it cannot be a powerful contributor to hip extension action. It just can't. All right, let's look at the next one here. Now here what I'm showing you is, on the left, the A markers are the gluteus, and the B is the adductors. So you can see the adductors are still fairly significant. They're bigger than the hamstring. And you can see that they participate almost equally, especially on the picture on the right, with hip extension. Now, I would argue that the adductors play less of a hip extension role as much as a counterbalancing force to the external rotation force of the gluteus maximus. Because the gluteus maximus fibers are at a diagonal, right? When you contract that muscle, the tendency will be for that femur to rotate externally. And in order to have that not happen, I think the adductor's job is to keep the femur straight. And so that's why we feel a lot of adductor participation when we squat. We might feel soreness the next day. We can't say for sure that it's because the actor played a forceful role in the hip extension. It might be that they played a significant role in preventing external rotation of the femur. But in any case, it is certainly bigger than the hamstring. So I encourage you to try this experiment at home. You can try it now, you can try it later. I want you to pull your leg up with your knee bent, right? And ask yourself, where do I feel that, right? So if you pull it in, you'll feel it in the glute. If you pull it out, you feel it in the adductor, but you feel nothing in the hamstring, nothing. And that's because the hamstring is a knee-oriented muscle. Unless that knee is straight, you can't even stretch it by fully flexing your hip. Whereas the gluteus and the adductors are hip-oriented muscles. They participate more in hip action than the hamstring can and than the hamstring does. That's just the nature. If you look at the mechanics, that is the nature of it. So now let us assign some percentages of participation of these three muscles. Okay, now what I've done here is I've lowballed it. I've said, let's just say the glutes participate 70% of the force production in hip extension. It's probably 80% or more. I wouldn't be surprised if the gluteus maximus is 82, 83% of the force producer in hip extension. Okay, but let's just say conservatively 70%. That leaves 30% that theoretically could be shared between the adductors and the hamstring. That's not actually the case because they can't possibly be even contributors. I mean, it's obvious the adductor plays a bigger role. It has to because of the leverage and the size, right? But even if they played an equal role, that means the hamstring is only a 15% contributor to hip extension, just by looking at the mechanics of it. It could be 10%. It could be 8%. It is not a strong hip extension muscle, and yet you're doing hip extension for hamstring development. What's the percent of participation that your hamstrings play in a leg curl? 100%. You're going to compare a 100% participation exercise with an 8 or a 10% participation exercise? This is what I mean by opening our eyes, using our logic, asking ourselves, does this even make sense? Why would we spend all this time and energy doing an exercise that's arguably not very fun to do, not very comfortable? I mean, if you're doing it for the glutes, All right, I wouldn't support that to some degree. With a slightly more bent knee and an arched back, I would support that to some degree. It's still not the best, but certainly it is a better gluteus exercise than a hamstring exercise. The hamstring just can't play much of a role. So now let's look at these EMG studies that showed, quote, significant activation of the hamstring during straight-legged deadlift. Again, EMG analysis does not measure muscle growth nor potential muscle growth. EMG analysis measures activation. Doesn't care if it's dynamic or isometric, doesn't care if it's early phase or late phase. These are all factors in muscle development, by the way. The EMG analysis shows a high mark, high activation for an isometric exercise, even though that's not a very good exercise. It'll also show for a late, I'll show you here these studies, for a late phase loaded exercise. Neither of those are good muscle building exercises. EMG analysis can be very misleading. Okay, so here, these are exercises for triceps. Now, you'll see the kickbacks there measured significantly higher than a lying barbell tricep extension. Now, we can say, why? Right now, Mike Israetel knows that an early phase loaded exercise like a lying barbell tricep extension is significantly more productive than a late phase loaded exercise like the tricep kickback. In fact, we could argue that the kickbacks is a lousy tricep exercise in comparison to an early phase loaded exercise. But if you're one of these people that claims to be evidence-based, and this is what's bothersome to me, is people don't question the evidence. People don't say that doesn't make sense. People don't say, well, I would go so far as to say that some of these people that claim to be trainers, I'm not saying Mike, I'm saying, some of these novice young trainers that have never been in the trenches, that don't know the way Mike does, that a skull crusher is a fantastic tricep builder. You live it, you breathe it, you know it. You do a tricep kickback and you feel the fact that you can't use nearly as much weight. You're completely depriving the stronger part of the range of motion. You're loading up the weakest part of the range of motion. The entire exercise is limited to the weakest part of that range of motion. It is a lousy tricep exercise. But if you're evidence-based and you don't have a lot of context and you don't know how to question these things, you'll say, oh, no, I mean, I'm going to train my clients with tricep kickbacks because the evidence shows that. No, don't do lying skull crushers because, the evidence shows that's an inferior. We can't do this. We have to use our brain. Here's another EMG study. Now, this showed that the power wheel had more rectus abdominis activation than the ab crunch. Now, those of us who have experienced this know that, you're on your hands and knees, you're rolling this thing out, you're not getting very much movement through the spine. You're not actually elongating the rectus abdominis and shortening the rectus abdominis the way you want to do with most dynamic exercises, right? It's mostly isometric. You're mostly moving at the hip, and there's a lot of other things working that don't need to be working. Hip flexors and lats and triceps and all kinds of things. And you're getting this very, very compromised benefit to the rectus abdominis as compared to a good abdominal crunch, which is just a killer exercise, right? Again, this doesn't make sense. So you can't just say, oh, I'm going to use this particular EMG study to support, the fact that the upper pecs benefits from incline presses and that hamstrings benefit from stiff leg, because you're picking and choosing, right? You know darn well that a lot of these studies don't make sense. So you can't then use the one you like. Here's another one. Now, we know that if you do a side plank, you're going to get isometric tension on the obliques, the internal, external obliques, right? Now, if you're evidence-based, you'd say, oh, this is a really good exercise. In fact, I'm going to make it a little bit more challenging by raising my upper leg up. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm showing you that kind of sideways pressure on that lower leg is definitely not healthy for a knee joint. Now, you might be able to tolerate it if you're young and you have stable knees. If you're not young and you don't have stable knees, putting this much body weight side pressure on that lower leg could potentially hurt those tendons, those ligaments, I mean, that are actually keeping your legs straight. There's also obviously a lot of body weight that you're jamming into that shoulder socket, all right? Not necessarily productive. If you wanted to do an isometric exercise, by the way, for the obliques, you could just pick up a cable from the side and just stand there with it. You'd have none of this sideways pressure on their knee and none of this, jamming the shoulder joint if you wanted to do isometric. But again, the point of this picture is to show you that this would rate as a high value exercise by EMG studies for the external obliques, even though it's not dynamic, even though there's no extension and contraction, there's no elongation and shortening. It just doesn't make sense. So here, what I want to show you is, as an example, you have a guy, he's going to make a rabbit disappear. Poof, it's gone. It's a magic trick. You've seen similar things like this, magic shows. Do you actually believe the rabbit disappeared? You don't. You know the rabbit, it's a trick. It's not as it appears. And why do you know that? Because you have a brain. And because the universe has rules. And in this case, the rule is the conservation of mass. Things can't spontaneously disappear. You know that. Just like the rule of the line of force. Whatever is directly opposite the line of force will be the most loaded. That's another rule, just like the conservation of mass, that is unequivocal. We have to look at logic, science, reason, and then mix it with these things that we see and decide when to believe, when not to believe what we're seeing. Daniel Boorstin is credited with this quote: "The greatest obstacle to progress is not the absence of knowledge, but the illusion of knowledge." And this is the problem. This is pervasive in a lot of areas where someone thinks they know and they move through the world preaching what they think they know, close-minded, not thinking of the possibility that maybe I don't have all the information necessary to know the truth. People are out there professing their illusion of knowledge with no interest in hearing or reading, i.e. my book, new information which could provide a better perspective, and in this case, allow your training to be more efficient. What does efficient mean? It means spending the least amount of energy to get the most amount of benefit. Not wasting time on an exercise that only has an 8% participation. Logically speaking, it's impossible for the hamstring to contribute more than approximately 15% of the hip extension force because of its poor mechanics and the dominance of the glutes. The EMG analysis is obviously registering the loaded hamstring stretch as activation. It does not register the limited force production nor insufficient range of motion. So if you want to say, well, if it's measuring loaded stretch, isn't that good? Isn't that productive? And the answer is very simply, if it is productive, if it is good, if it is adequate, then we would be using that and only that for everything else. And yet there isn't a single other exercise that we do in the gym that only is loaded stretch. By the way, you can do a seated leg curl, pull yourself forward and get hamstring stretch and knee flexion. You get the best of both worlds. So why do an exercise that only has the stretch part? It just doesn't make sense. So Mike posted this on the video. The book, again, pretending he read it, claims that SDLs don't cause enough muscle contraction. Then he says it's absurd. And then he uses that, again, that study that showed the EMG analysis. I'll tell you what's absurd is to know the limited force capacity of the hamstring during hip extension and still endorse it. That's absurd. Seeing the mechanics, seeing that this hamstring muscle can not produce more than 8%, 10%, maybe 12%, maybe less of the hip extension force production. And yet you're going to do it for hamstring development? That's absurd. Also absurd is not knowing the compromised mechanics of the hamstring and pretending to be an authority in resistance exercise. Anyone who wants to be an authority has to understand the mechanics. You can't just close your eyes and say, well, the EMG study said this. You have to use your eyes. You have to use your brain. You have to look behind the curtain. Something doesn't make sense here. Also absurd is knowing the limitations of EMG analysis and then using it as evidence, even though you refute other EMG studies because, well, you think they're absurd. Well, either we understand that an EMG study is limited in all cases, or we don't. We have to understand it's a limited value. Now, here's a picture of me doing leg curls. This is, I would say, 1986. Decent hamstrings. Never did straight-legged deadlifts. Never liked them. Even before I understood the mechanics the way I do now, I just intuitively thought this is nonsense compared to a leg curl. You can get more than adequate hamstring development leg curl. And this is back when, you know, we didn't even have a seated leg curl yet. You can see that we had already gotten to beyond the flat leg curl. You know, they were putting a hump. This is a flex leg curl machine. They were already putting a hump in it, tacitly acknowledging that the hip needs to have a degree of bend to avoid, they didn't know it yet, but to avoid active insufficiency, which is what happens when your hip is too straight. This is a picture of my hamstring at the age of 54, which was about 8 years ago. Again, just leg curls. That's a side view, age 54. You can get plenty of hamstring development with a leg curl if you have the genetics that allows you to develop hamstrings. If you don't, step-legged deadlifts aren't gonna solve that problem for you. So the next question Mike asked was this. A quote from my book: another benefit of the one-arm pull-in is that you can pull your arm down and in farther than you'd be able to during standard lat pull downs. This allows a little less range of motion at the top where it's risky and more range of motion at the bottom for a better contraction. So, you know, it seems to be a pattern. He sees where I put where it's risky and then jumps to the conclusion that the reason I'm recommending this is because the top part of the range of motion is really worrisome. That's not what I said. Here's a picture of the exercise that I'm describing, and there's the paragraph where I say another benefit of this particular exercise, using one arm at a time, is that you can pull your upper arm downward and inward farther than you'd be able to during standard pull downs. Okay, so you can see that range of motion there looks extremely productive, is in fact extremely productive. But then later, Mike put this comment in the video section. The book claims, again, the book, as if he read the whole book, claims, as if he read the few pages around this paragraph, the book claims that vertical lat pulls all the way to the top are needlessly dangerous. It's not apparent at all why this would be the case, as lat tendon ruptures from deep pull-ups in the 5 to 30 rep range are exceedingly rare. All right, well, so what I'm showing you right there on the left, the green arrows, that's the exercise we're talking about. And what I've circled right there is the paragraph I just showed you. Okay, I just want to show you where it is on the page. All right, so keep in mind, that's the paragraph he read. 2 paragraphs above it. Is that 2? Is that 1? 1. It is 1 paragraph before it. So all you have to do was read the previous paragraph. As the operating lever, which is the upper arm bone, the humerus, moves downward and inward during one-arm pull-ins, it becomes progressively more active, which means it becomes more perpendicular with the direction of the cable. It reaches the most perpendicular angle about halfway into the range of motion. This allows the latissimus to coincide with the mechanical advantage it's gaining. In other words, when the latissimus muscle is able to pull perpendicular on the humerus, that's the same time that the humerus is getting perpendicular resistance from the cable, right? So the mechanical advantage and disadvantage work together. You get the ideal resistance curve by having that angle of resistance, right? So when he says it's not entirely clear, well, just read the previous paragraph. Nothing there is emphasizing a risk with going higher. It is because it produces the ideal resistance curve. Again, the issue is not risk. We're looking for the most favorable resistance curve and the optimal line of force. So in this slide, I'm showing you the direction of pull of the lats, and the next one I'll show you the direction of pull of the cable. So you can see that as the arm moves through that arc around the shoulder joint, the latissimus fibers pull on the humerus from different angles, right? So what you want is you want a direction of resistance that's directly opposite the direction of pull of the latissimus fibers. Those fibers are not mostly vertical. Those fibers are diagonal. The upper fibers are arguably horizontal. So what are you going to do with a horizontal fiber that is getting a vertical resistance? Not much. It's not sensible. You want a direction of resistance that's going to give all of those fibers, the lowest fibers and the highest fibers, a good amount of opposing resistance. So here's what I've done here. I've shown you the up arrow, the burgundy dot would be an overhead straight down pull in versus this. So you can see that we're trying to create an opposing resistance for the latissimus arrows. That's what you want. You want the direction of resistance to be directly opposite those arrows indicating the direction of pull of the lats. You're going to do that much more successfully with a 45-degree angle than you will straight up. It's not so much about risk, even though the shoulder joint does feel better when you don't let it go higher than a certain point. He sort of misses the point. Look, my general consensus is this. My general conclusion is this. Mike's comments and criticisms are partly based on him not having the context that reading the book would have given him. And also, he seems to have some confirmation bias. He tends to want to believe certain things. And so he'll defend those things with arguments that kind of don't hold water very well. It's good to pull back the curtain. It's good to question things. And it's good to listen to people who might have something reasonable to say. Don't close the door and just assume that you know it all. This could be the scientist and the sensible person's mantra. This is what we should all, the attitude we should all have in regard to anything you think you know. I think I know what is true today based on the information I have at my disposal at this moment. However, I may not have sufficient information to know for sure that what I think I know is actually true. I may also have a bias, a personal preference for what I want to believe is true. Sometimes these personal biases are very subconscious. We don't even know we actually want something to be true. We don't want that other thing to be true. And that would lead people to be closed-minded about new information. This is human nature. We have to accept that this is human nature. We have to make efforts to be open-minded. It's easy, especially in today's social media. Everybody is like, trying to bash everybody. Everyone is saying, I know the truth. You're a jerk. You don't know what you're talking about. Let's listen. Let's open our ears, right? I mean, obviously, there are people that, make some really ridiculous statements. And sometimes it makes sense to say, well, they made some pretty ridiculous statements in the past. I don't know whether I want to listen to them now, but I think most of the things I've said have been very reasonable, and it's worth listening to, and we should be open-minded about that. Therefore, I'm willing to look, listen, and to think, to consider the logic of what is being presented before I am, because I am more interested in finding the truth than on being right. That's what we have to believe, is we have to be truth seekers, not just defenders of what our position has been. Let us not be Agnes in the Gilded Age, who said, I'm not concerned with facts, not if it interferes with my beliefs. Let us not be that, right? Let us be open-minded and realize that everything we think we know right now, we think we know based on certain things that we think represent all of the elements of truth, and therefore we've concluded this. But sometimes, very often, we don't have all the information in order to be so sure about our position. I want to be clear here. I believe we should seek to identify the exercises that have a compromised value and either eliminate them or minimize them as much as possible, given whatever our circumstances are in terms of equipment availability or whatever. I believe we should emphasize the exercises that have high value based on specific biomechanical markers, the 16 factors that are listed on my website that are consistent across the board. They apply to all the exercises. They talk about the joint angles. They talk about the direction of resistance, the direction of anatomical motion, avoiding neurological interference. All of these things are factors that can be applied evenly across the board to determine which exercises have higher value or lower value. I believe it's sensible to strive for maximum benefit, the least wasted effort, and the least injury risk. And that is the goal of trying to evaluate, let's say, a straight-legged deadlift or an incline press, and deciding whether or not it has high value or whether it's just kind of a wasted effort. It's going to give you maybe 10% benefit, 2% benefit, 8% benefit, but not enough to justify the investment of time and energy, and possibly not enough to risk the injury. I believe it's foolish to perform exercises that have compromised efficacy, productivity, that are also possibly energy inefficient. They require more weight to give a certain amount of load than another exercise that's more mechanically efficient could provide, and or have a higher injury risk. And you do these exercises because they're old school, because they're ego gratifying, because you identify with them, because you've been known for decades as the guy with the biggest bench press or the guy with the biggest overhead press, and heaven forbid you lose that identity, or because you believe they're supported by these studies, which you arguably cannot place much confidence in. These are my beliefs. These are my goals. Look, I'd be happy to stand next to Mike. I'm 62 years old. If he wants to compare upper pecs with me on stage, if he wants to compare hamstring with me on stage, I'm open to that. Like, obviously, you know, we have different structures and all that. Here's the thing that we have to acknowledge. The question isn't whether a person can develop a great physique using many exercises, many of which are not necessarily great. We've seen this many, many times. We've seen Arnold, we've seen Franco Columbu, we've seen a lot of these people with magnificent physiques doing exercises that are not all great. That's not the question. The question is, can a person develop an outstanding physique using only the best exercise, which I've narrowed it down to about 20, with some substitutions, of course, only the best ones. And you move the inefficient exercises out, you save time, you save wasted effort, you reduce the risk of injury. That's the question. And the answer, I believe, is yes. That's what I aim to prove. That's what I write about. That's what I speak about. That's what I'm demonstrating. And at 62 years old, I'll be getting on stage in September, and I'll show you still at 62 years old that I can develop a stage physique using only 20. I work out in a garage. I don't have a leg press. I don't have a Smith machine. I don't have a power rack. I don't have a barbell. I don't need a barbell. You can get fantastic results with limited equipment. I mean, fantastic results with limited equipment if you know which exercises produce the most gains and waste the least amount of effort. That's our goal. Thank you for watching this video, keeping an open mind, using your eyes and logic, learning a little bit about how the body works, what's explained in my book and in our online courses. I want to thank Mo for helping me coordinate this thing, because I'm kind of not very tech kind of guy.
Well, thank you very much for that, first of all, because I know how busy you are. And I think, in my opinion, this is what I was expecting when I heard the first time that you will be talking to Mike Israetel. I wanted to learn something. And I was surprised, because when I watched that, I said, wow, that was really good. And in the comment section, I said, well, I'm glad that this happened, because Mike Israetel will not let something go unless he's convinced. And then I was surprised. That's why I sent you his answer and the 5 topics that he sent, which led to this amazing video, because I don't think that other fitness influencers are doing this type of videos for free online to educate people, you know. And this is a glimpse of what you will get in our online courses and in the book. If you really want information that will help you for the next few years to build a great body without hurting yourself, you should invest in this. I was surprised when he said that he wasn't convinced. And as I said, like it can, like now we have great video that people can learn from it. Um, I hope that this give more clarity to that first video. In case people didn't see it, I recommend they go and watch it. And let us know what you think in the comment section. If there is anything that you're convinced or not convinced with, share it with us. Doc, thank you very much for your time, and thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next video.